So the first difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics is that microeconomics deals with individual economic problems, which you have heard last time when I taught it. The individual economic problems are like maximizing my satisfaction from buying something, spending my money, or how much income I can earn, how I can increase my income level. But when it comes to macroeconomic problems, it's much more difficult because individuals are different. So they all have to be taken into consideration. So some forms of aggregation is required. They have to be aggregated. And the typical macroeconomic problems that you hear on TV, read in newspapers, are the inflation problem, why prices are rising so much, everybody talks about it. The unemployment problem, why there are so many people unemployed. In US, for instance, every day if you open a Western news channel, you hear that US unemployment rate is one of the highest in last 80 years. It's like they compare that with the Great Depression of the 1930s. They had Great Depression of the 1930s. So they have, these are the typical macroeconomic problems. And the variables that you hear, other than this, are these, they talk about exchange rates, they talk about private consumption, they talk about private investment. Why isn't investment enough in the country? Then they also talk about government's expenditure and government's policies. Government typically spends in a country too. So before we can take up any serious discussion, any kind of set up an analytical framework for your macroeconomic issues, and this is a course on macroeconomic theory, I need to tell you about the economic systems that exist, because without knowing the economic systems, it is very difficult to understand the macroeconomic issues. Now, the economic systems are typically determined by the political systems. So you have the socialist system, then you had the other extreme, the capitalist system. In the capitalist system, you typically own capital privately. And in the socialist system, the word is the government would tell you that we are doing the best for you, all are equal. But it is most undemocratic because in the socialist system, the government would then decide everything for you. So you don't have any personal freedom. Now, the typical examples of these extreme political come economic systems. Typical examples, you know, the USSR was this socialist system example. Some East European countries were there, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, to some extent Poland also, East Germany, and the capitalist system examples, you know, Japan, West Germany, most Western countries, Canada, United States, etc. But the funny thing is that these extreme kind of situations don't exist all over. The economies that exist in most countries are a mix of the two. If you take India, for instance, you had Tatas and Birlas, not many of them. Now you have many private sector companies. 50 years back, you had Tatas and Birlas. In fact, Tatas and Birlas were founded before independence. So you had Tatas and Birlas and other private companies along with huge public sector companies, because government was following the footsteps of socialist countries like Soviet Russia. It adopted the economic modeling pattern from them, which is called 5-year plans. And they use those 5-year plans to plan for the country. So what you're doing essentially you're talking about a socialist system, because government is doing a 5-year plan for the entire country, including industry, including infrastructure, and also government essentials like defense, roads, police services, the bureaucracy we have, IS, IFS offices. So they had an emphasis, overemphasis you can say, on public sector. That started changing from the early 90s. That's called the reform period. Now, I will talk about the reform period later. It's not a course on reform period or reforms in India. But the mix was heavily tilted towards public sector-led development. So it is essentially a socialist economic system. They were trying to adopt, but mixing it with private sector, very interesting. Private sector may, unlike socialist, pure socialist countries, they had Tatas and Birlas also. So they, what we call, they had a mixed economy. And the world had mixed economies, many places. I tell you, France is a typical case in the Western world which had the most socialist flavor. In fact, the socialist prime minister has just been voted in. The president has just been voted in. And the other one just left. You can see how it goes back and forth. But would you call France a socialist country? No, it's a mixed economy maybe. Politically, it is sometimes getting aligned more towards the left and sometimes towards the right. In fact, if you look at the political systems of most countries, what interestingly you may find, predominantly the economic system may be capitalist system. All right? But the political alignments are basically two types, if you have seen the political parties. US ka example le lijiye. You have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Which belongs to which, if you have any association, if you want to classify them, which belongs to which one? The Democratic Party, is it more left or right oriented? Left. And the Republican Party is more right. Now you listen to what the Republicans have to say on TV if you ever have an opportunity to listen to them, and what the Democrats say. Democrats are typically interested with healthcare systems, you will hear that, which is trying to care for everybody. The Republicans would talk about giving more freedom to the private sector. Democrats will talk about infrastructure development, more emphasis. All right? They would rather leave many of these jobs to the private sector. So this has been going on even in capitalist systems, pure capitalist systems. All right. Now the question is, before I get into macroeconomic theory, one thing I want to tell you, which I told the class in the previous lecture, that there are the models, if you see. What are models? Models are essential in economics algebraic models based on certain assumptions. You will see them a lot in this course. If you look at the models, what they have been trying to do, they have been trying to study kind of three kinds of macroeconomic issues. One is a very long run behavior of a country, the macroeconomy. This is referred to as the growth economics. It has a typical name, growth economics. Very long run behavior means in academic, in terms of calendar years, it will be roughly, it will be something like maybe 30, 40, 50 years. Some long run studies have also been on a 100-year period. 100-year, some studies have been there. पिछले 100 साल से क्या हो रहा है? Now, this very long run behavior often is associated with an area, a branch of economics called growth economics. And then you have the long run behavior, which is typically a 10-year, 15-year period. So from the very long run, you can come to a 10, 15-year period, and you can study the behavior of the economy, long run. Then you have these models which more or less are together, the short run and the medium run model, which is like a snapshot of a long run behavior. So it would be concerned with maybe a few months, maybe a year, maybe a year and a half. So it's like you're watching a film and then you suddenly stop the film moving and you have only one picture and focusing on that. So in a very long run, you cut down the period to a 1/4, 1/3, 1/10 of it, 10-year period or so. Then you get a long run snapshot of the economy, a moving economy. Then it becomes very static when you go into within a long run period and focus on a 6-month period, 8-month period. I was giving the example of you joining IIT, starting from high school. So from high school to end of IIT education is like a long run period. But if I want to take the high school last year or IIT Kanpur first year and try to know what you have been doing, how you were feeling, how you could cope with the pressures, what were the problems, how you found the solutions to that. Counseling service does this kind of a job here. Then you can see you are getting into a medium run, short run model. Now, in terms of analytical framework, it's very interesting too. If you look at the very long run period, the growth models are typically time derivatives of variables involved. In growth models, typical time derivatives of variables, because you're watching a variable move over time, a very long time. So you have y dot and r dot and m dot, whatever they stand for, as variables in the model. Growth economics. Now when you go to the long run, which is about 10 years or 12 years, sometimes 8-year period, you typically see a variable moving in a more or less static framework where assumptions are constant. Now, if you go into a long run, you don't see a dynamic variable all the time there for a 10-year period. You see the variable data plotted as it moves over a 10-year period. Is a manageable diagram or even a chart or whatever you have, and focusing on that. And in the long run, the typical assumptions that economists make are very interesting. They make that the technology is not going to change much, because technology is a key factor to how much a country is producing. And in fact, some people say that technological difference is the most important factor that defines what India is today and what US is today. Many people say. You look at your development, Microsoft, where is it coming from? They didn't originate in India. So they are getting developed somewhere, getting utilized, and at the second stage or third stage, they are coming to you. So essentially, the technology is a very important determining factor in the modern era. In fact, it has been there for a long time now. Maybe since the Industrial Revolution, the mid-19th century, 1850s. Now, that's when the Industrial Revolution in the Western world started. England in particular. Now, if you look at the long run behavior, you don't find a dynamic variable in that sense with a time derivative variable, but you do see a variable moving over time. And the typical assumptions are technology is not going to change much, resources are not going to change much, even number of people. In this period, you don't take example of India. It jumps by millions, a long run period, number of people. But you take other countries maybe. And therefore, what they typically have is that the aggregate supply curve, which are very important in economics, you know that, for the supply and demand curves. The aggregate supply curve is typically vertical. Means it's not going to change. Like supply, if you can visualize that the output is measured on the x-axis and the corresponding price is measured on the y-axis. If you have a problem with this basic microeconomics, or economics, you can consult any introductory book in the library. First 2 chapters will give you that, if you have any problem. So typically we draw a supply or demand curve with output on the good that is demanded or supplied on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis. So a vertical curve means what? You're fixing the value on the x-axis and fixing it, essentially saying it's not going to change. Why is it not going to change? Because you are making these assumptions that technology is not going to change and resources is not going to change. So who is going to change the output level so much? But the point is, you may consider, then sir, output should not move at all. Well, we'll come to that discussion later. In the long run. That creates a confusion. Then in the long run, output should not change at all. Well, there is some confusion. But typically what they have is the supply curve vertical. And then when you come to short run, medium run models within the long run period, from period to period, like a long run is consisting of many short runs. 8 महीने का short run, 10 महीने का 10 months short run, 12 months short run, 15 months short run, whatever. then you see the output level changing within the long run. But that is not called a long run study. That is, you are focusing now on a particular period within the long run, so it becomes a short run or a medium run. No fixed calendar time is involved here. It can be any time. A short run can be 6 months duration, a short run can be 8 months duration, a short run can be 1 year duration. So you would ask me, sir, how would you define them? Well, it varies. An economist, like a doctor, studies the pulse of the patient, checks certain parameters, and then concludes whether this short run is a 10-month period short run or a 6-month period short run. All right? Neither it is arbitrary, but it can change. Not like a calendar year, 12 month में 1 year होता है. Average on a 30 days 1 month होता है. ऐसा नहीं है. अच्छा. So this short run and long run, short run and medium run is something that interests me, because this is where the debate is on TV presently going on the past 2 years. How to cope with the economic problems. And how to cope with economic problems, and the economic problems they are typically talking about is, you will hear words like inflation, recession. All right? Sometimes some exchange rate problems they talk about. Yesterday also it was there on TV. Now these issues may persist over a long period of time, but they are essentially short-run economic problems. So the economist, the most important economist of our country is the finance minister, because he announces policies, and there he has a right-hand man also who helps him, who does the monetary policy. Who is that? The finance minister has a kind of a cousin brother, very close to him, the central bank governor, who does the monetary policy. And these two people are often on TV talking about economic policy, and sometimes their advisors are also there. Okay. Now the point that I'm trying to make is, these guys are talking about economic problems on TV. Sir, are they talking about long-run economic problems, very long-run economic problems? Because accordingly I can think about which model to use, to know what they're saying, to understand what they're saying. I think they're usually talking about short-run and medium-run economic problems. So now let me focus on the short-run and medium-run economic problems. The diagram that I drew is that if you typically watch an economy moving over time, you take one variable, I take the output variable, which is most convenient. In fact, that's the focus also, because output generates income, isn't it? If you're producing something, you're paying the factors of production. So when you're paying the factors of production, they're earning something. So if output level grows up, income would also go up. So this is all very good news. So we can focus on output. So what you typically find is that if I draw a two-dimensional diagram like this, and I have time here, and I have, say, y dot is essentially the time derivative of output. This is y dot. Then what you find, the growth rate in output, y dot, which is in calculus dy dt in discrete terms, if you want to actually measure y dot from the data without using calculus, then what you have is yt minus 1 over yt minus 1. And you can take a percentage number also. You could multiply that with 100 and get a percentage number. That is in discrete terms, what I said. No. This is the way we measure. Yt minus 1 over yt. That's an absolute change. Time period change will be 1 delta t. So yt minus 1 will be absolute change then. The rate of change is yt minus 1 over yt minus 1. What you are talking about is an absolute change, because the delta t is 1. One period to the next period, maybe 1 month. I'm phasing it out and watching the variable change every 1 month, 1 year, 2 months. It won't make any sense. All right. Now, this variable y dot would typically show something like this, movement. Going up and down, up and down. Now, this is actual data on y dot, suppose it is, then these cyclical movements are known as business cycles. And these business cycles occur in the short run and medium run. All right? So now what is the short run and a medium run here? Typically what they do, they can start from the top of a cycle, which they call the peak, and watch the line go down to the bottommost, which they call the trough. And then it goes up to a shorter peak, very interesting. Peaks are not of the same height. It can go up to a shorter peak, come back a little bit down, maybe a small recession, a small coming down, then going up again and reaching a higher peak, again coming down. This is the typical behavior of a growth rate in output. I will bring actual output numbers one day, maybe bring a slide and show that to you. That will be fun, India's actual numbers. All right? And this time period, don't ask me. Because here, if you start in June 1990, the trough you may have reached in December 1990. The next one you may have reached in February 1991. Do mane kandar. And it has completed one kind of a cycle, complete. One peak to another peak via trough. Now, the words, the use of terminologies with business cycles don't end here. The peak and a trough now can be a very high peak. Let me use a color chalk. Can be a very high peak like this, which if the economy reaches, then they don't only say the finance minister is just not smiling a little bit and calling news conference on his own. Otherwise, if it is a recession, the finance minister is usually asked to give a maybe news conference because he doesn't want to talk about the negative things. But when it reaches like that, finance minister may be calling 2 news conferences every day. It's such a good news. And there what we say is the economy is booming. So this is the boom time for the economy. The peak is so high. And in Western countries, they have seen, I will talk about that later, in booming economy, the economy may be achieving overemployment. There is no unemployment. Over full employment they may be reaching. And I will define full employment a little bit later. All right? Is it all right with you, everybody? So boom is such a good time, like not only people have jobs, they are all happy, but people have extra jobs, extra money they can earn if they want. All right. So boom is that. And another thing is there. This trough, which is quite low, is not only a trough. Well, this is also a trough. This is also a trough. This is also a trough. But this trough is a very interesting trough, which has come quite deep. And let me tell you something which may disturb you a little bit. This line that I've drawn can have y dot line, which is rate of change in y, can very well have a pattern where you will see there is a line that exists, which is the 0 value line. So essentially, y dot has become negative here. And it is positive somewhere else. So this is a 0 line. You may still find that. So what you are essentially saying, therefore, that the y dot rate of change in output can be greater than or even less than 0. This is what you are saying. Growth rate in output is falling and negative. It happened in the Western world recently. It hasn't happened in India yet, in the current recession. You must be hearing about the recession. world recession, European crisis, India's recession. So it is going down the positive growth rate from 10% to 8% to 6%, but still positive. But it may so happen it may go into the negative axis and can become negative. And if it is really negative, then this trough has a name which is very disturbing, just the opposite of boom, which is called the economy is in depression. The economy has gone into a depression. Okay? So therefore, what I'm trying to say here is that it can be a peak, a very high peak can be boom. It can be a trough, but a very low trough is depression. Like a person is very depressed, means he is very unhappy, whereas a man is unhappy. There's a difference. All right. And also you should know two more things which are important. When you have the upswing, when you have the upswing of a cycle, like this, it is called the recovery of the economy. From a trough, it is recovery of the economy. And when you have a downswing of the economy, all right, this is called the recession. When the downswing of the economy is in recession. So, abhi samajh gaya? Have you understood these words you hear often on TV, newspapers? Economy is sliding into a recession. That means output growth rate is falling. Industrial growth rate last quarter means 3 months. It has come out to be negative. Recession deepening in India now. Earlier we were boasting the world has recession, India has a mild recession. The world has depression, India has no depression. But the industrial growth rate of output, the data that has come out recently, the last quarter data, it has become negative, IIP growth rate. So we need to talk about that, why it can happen, how to cure that. Because after all, we would study cyclical models, short-run models. And you know what, this short run can also be shown as a long run. What is a long run period? Essentially, they would take an average. This long run, essentially they would take an average of this, and they would fit statistically a linear trend line. Statistics students understand, linear trend line, and they would typically show the secular trend like this, a linear trend line. And they will say the path on this, if you follow and you cancel out these fluctuations and average them out, you get a long run path of the economy. That is the long run path of the economy. This is what they say. There are some areas of confusion here, but we'll take that up if I can later. Okay. So now these cyclical movements, essentially we would talk about. And one more point I mentioned, I'm repeating myself, I'm sorry, but tomorrow, and then these fellows came late. From the next class onwards, it will be much more consistent, but you have to come early. You have registered and made a huge number here, very big number. You have to be on time here. Now, what you have here is that, okay, we will talk about the business cycle models maybe, or whatever it is, and short-run, medium-run models. But what we need to do is watch the assumptions, make them clear, and essentially we would talk about, these are called stabilization policies. Stabilization policies in the sense, you notice here that the actual data has gone up and down, sometimes more down, sometimes more up. Now suppose you find that in India what is happening presently, the output growth rate is falling sharply maybe, little bit faster than before. We are in a recession still. We were in a recession. We are in a recession, but a deeper recession maybe forecasted. There are forecasting statistical models also. Suppose somebody is forecasting that the recession is going to deepen. Now, the job of the economists or the finance minister, etc., is how to check the rapid decline so that we make it slow, even if it is going down. We won't be able to stop it from going down, but how to check the speed, the velocity, and lengthen the period so that it goes down over a longer period, not so sharply, like somebody falling while playing on the slip. You know, the slip head, these children, they ride. Suppose it's a very steep one, okay? Then he or she can fall with a higher velocity and can have a major injury, as opposed to a less inclined slope there. So how we can check that? Similarly, when it is climbing up, if it climbs up too quickly, it's like it's very overwhelming. And the fear may be there in people's mind that it is going up so quickly. Well, watch out, it will reach the peak and then suddenly start coming downwards quickly. So how can we slow it down so that it reaches the peak slowly, stays there for a while, instead of going up, hit the ceiling and fall on the floor, okay? That will be very painful. So you slowly ride, you go up and move, all right, like a swing, so that you check the speed, the velocity going up, and then it rests there or stays there for a while, and then maybe starts climbing down, because that's inevitable in a capitalist economy. Now, these kind of issues are essentially what we call stabilization policies. How to stabilize the path, how to make it more stable. And the typical stabilization policies that we would talk about are the fiscal and the monetary policies that the government has, typically. So these traditional stabilization policies we talk about, and the context in which stabilization policies are discussed is essentially short-run, medium-run models when the cycles are active, not over a very long-run period. So the real macroeconomic policies or problems that we often talk about or we are concerned with are short-run and medium-run. So we will talk about that. All right. Before I conclude this section, and in this connection of short-run, medium-run, long-run, very long-run models, the typical diagrammatic, very quick explanation or understanding, maybe it helps to understand these models, are as follows. Let me see if you understand this. If I can erase this board, this particular diagram. As I said, that a long-run period is usually assumed that output has stabilized. All right? So in a static framework, long-run models typically have this output on this axis and price on this axis, an aggregate demand curve, AD, which is aggregate demand like this, and an aggregate supply, which is vertical. Typically, they have models based on this kind of a assumption that the market or the economy looks like this. The aggregate market, the economy, essentially. Aggregate market is the economy. Y is nothing but output. And P is nothing but price. Now, when you go to short-run and medium-run models, typically you will see in the short run, sometimes they call that in microeconomics very short run, but in macroeconomics we call that short run. In the short run, we typically have a situation where Y and P, if they are measured, then the supply curve is perfectly elastic. So this is aggregate supply curve, and the demand curve is like this. Typically, you have the short run. Perfectly elastic means what? So perfectly elastic basically means, this is perfectly elastic, this is a horizontal curve, perfectly elasticity. You can open a microeconomics book and find out the definition of elasticity. Essentially, for a small change in price, quantity changes an enormous amount, so a very elastic situation, very responsive. It essentially means companies have unutilized capacity. So if you place a demand, output will be given to you immediately, supplied to you. There's no constraint on the output that you need in the short run. The market is so kind of full of excess capacity that if you place a demand, you will get the output. आप कंपनी को बताइए हमको इतना चाहिए कल, वो बताए कल नहीं होगा, परसों आपको दे दूंगा. कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है, no scarcity. Whereas long run, you have reached the saturation point. If you ask the companies to produce more, they won't be able to produce. This is the assumption of aggregate supply being vertical. You cannot produce more than that. It's kind of fixed here. And this is a very interesting point. I will talk about that. This is called the full employment point. But let me talk about that later, full employment. And in a short run model, what you have is the supply curve is just the opposite, horizontal. Means jo chahte hain wo, if you pay the price, some price P naught, then you can have any amount that you demand. So this model essentially therefore becomes, if I use a different color, this is essentially a demand determined model. This is a demand determined situation, all right, this kind of a theory or model. And this one is essentially a supply determined model. All right? Supply determined means what? Supply would tell you how much output can be produced, the supply curve. You cannot change it. Here, the demand curve will tell you how much will be produced. If the demand curve shifts, more can be produced. If demand curve shifts backwards, lesser amount will be produced. It's a demand determined model. Demand has the most power here. Demand decides how much companies would produce. Essentially, demand determined model. Now, a medium run model that we also talk about, in fact, later I won't use medium run. I will call all of them short run. But for the time being, I'm calling it medium run model. Now, the medium run model that we often deal with in this course is that here you allow, it's a more reasonable model, you allow both the supply curve and the demand curve to play a role. So it is neither supply determined nor purely demand determined. So essentially what you have here is that if you have Y here and P here, you have an aggregate demand curve like this, and you have an aggregate supply curve like this. Both. In this case, this is, in mathematical terms, a simultaneous equation model. There are two equations. They are together required to solve the two unknowns x and y. This is a simultaneous equation model, essentially. There are two equations. They together solve x and y value. Not any one particular equation determines the value of y or p, as a matter of fact. So together they determine. This is typically what you find in microeconomics textbooks. The supply curve is upward sloping, the demand curve is downward sloping. Together, it's a complete model. Two unknowns, p and y, like x and y. Two equations, two unknowns, it's a determined system. But these are exceptions. So this is how, diagrammatically, using microeconomic tools, I can have a first visual representation of these macroeconomic models, not the very long run. The long run, the short and the medium run. Is it all right? Okay? All right. Now there are some interesting issues here. We would like to talk about that a little bit, about the concept of employment. Because they do come up in discussion when we talk about cyclical models and growth rate in output. Because growth rate in output is connected with employment, unemployment rate in the economy. It's very common sense, even if you don't have an exact relationship, statistically estimated or something. It's very common sense that the growth rate of output is associated with the income, as well as the employment vis-a-vis unemployment in the economy. If the growth is poor in recession, what do you expect? There will be more unemployment. It's very common sense. It doesn't require economics to understand this. But there are certain words certain terminology is used in connection with this, and there is a very interesting thing given by an American economist long time back. So I want to mention that before I go into the structural features of a macro model and more or less conclude this topic. This is the introductory topic. Having known the three areas of macroeconomics, and that we would focus on the short run and medium run economic problems, which is fascinating to me. And this is most topical also. If you open TV, you hear macroeconomic discussions. There are hardly any discussion on growth economics, hardly any long run economics. Most of the time they're talking about recession problem, inflation problem, unemployment problem, which are all short run, medium run situations that they want to deal with or they discuss. Now, having done that, therefore you would understand if I say that these macroeconomists are typically trying to watch the output growth rate, of course, and whether the output growth rate is achieving something or not. How would they know whether the output growth rate is good or bad? The thing what they do, the Western economists in particular, in India we have so much of unutilized resources and so much of unemployment, so many people underemployed, means not having a proper job, have a job, not a proper job, what they want, underemployed, and so many people have these no employment at all, that we really don't talk about them much here. We talk about output growth rate and that's good enough. If output growth rate increases, we are all happy because more people will get jobs, more income will be generated. But in Western countries, situations are different in developed countries. So what they look for is just not the output growth rate. They look at something called a variable, a situation called full employment. So I want to explain full employment to you. This is very important. Now, this issue about full employment is essentially a statistical issue because you have to find a number for your country's output level, or in terms of employment level, to conclude whether the economy is at full employment, under full employment, or over full employment. It's essentially a statistical issue to find out what the number full employment is for a country. In a country like India, the problem is we don't have registered unemployments. We don't have a proper accounting of how many people are employed, how many people are underemployed, how many people are unemployed, etc. We don't. How many people are there, we don't know also probably. But in other countries where population pressure is less, they can count. And they have a practice that if you are unemployed, you go and register. Most unemployed people do. So let me talk about this unemployment, full employment, this situation, because that is essentially connected with these models. So if I say full employment is the bliss, is the goal that the economists want to reach, where in simple words it means all people are employed. So given what the present situation is, we can say how much growth rate in output is required to reach that. Very simple. An output level which would employ sufficient people so that you can say the economy has full employment. Because output and employment are connected. Through, in microeconomics, we teach that production function. Production function teaches why output depends upon factors of production, where one is capital, one is labor, and other things. So the question is how you compute that number, where you say the economy is fully employed, and to be honest with you, resources are just not labor in a country. There are many other resources. Capital is there. Non-labor issues like land is there. So when you say an economy is fully employed, you must be saying that labor and all other resources are properly employed. Now, beyond this point, I'm not going to say much about full employment because in India we don't calculate full employment. It's not possible. We don't have an estimate. We don't have an estimate even how many people are there. We don't have, of course, an estimate how many people are unemployed. It's impossible to do that. But suppose you can do that, then the funny thing is that even at full employment level of employment, common sense would tell you 100% people are employed. And that's not the case. Because the measurement says that full employment also takes into consideration some amount of unemployment. You would wonder, sir, what kind of a full employment is this? You use the word fully employed, but the economy is actually not fully employed. There is some amount of unemployment still there. The reason is, at full employment, the amount of unemployment that you get is known as frictional unemployment. Now, what these economists are saying when they compute the number for full employment, they say there can be frictional unemployment. And what is frictional unemployment? Well, with full employment, of course, the economy is doing very well. Maybe it's booming. All right? Quite possibly it's booming. It's doing very well. But still you allow for some unemployment because some people are not totally happy with the jobs they have. They quit the jobs and they're totally confident they can wait out 1 month, 15 days, 2 months and will get a better job. So this transition period of one person who is a skilled labor or whatever is fully confident that he can give up job X, wait out 2 months and will get job Y, where the pay scale, benefits, whatever are much better. So the economy always allows for some amount of unemployment even at full employment level. So full employment doesn't mean, literally speaking, although it means fully employed, doesn't mean everybody has a job. Some people are deliberately not in the job market, looking for another job. They need not be unemployed, what I'm saying. Depends upon the rules of a country. If there is one minimum wage, legal minimum wage, if an unemployed person is there, he will get legal minimum wage. He has no choice. He will not be frictionally unemployed. But it usually happens with skilled labor. It usually happens with skilled labor. Skilled labor. I'm coming to that. So now the question is, are you really now talking about all people employed? Of course not. There has to be a minimum age when you can work. Otherwise, you have the child labor case, which is rampant in India. Western countries often don't buy goods from us because of child labor, because their laws say children cannot be employed. Have you noticed the Norway case happened? A very funny situation happened with a couple's kids, Bengali couple, 2 kids. Norway, literally like confiscated property, took it away from the parents, kept them in foster homes. They are very funny countries. So it's not like us, children चाय वाला के दुकान में तो बच्चे लोग काम करते ही है. मकान में तो मैं बच्चे लोग को काम करने कितना देखा है. छोटा से बड़ा हुआ बच्चे लोग काम करते हैं. Either the maid servant's son or the daughter or somebody who is underage working along with mother. But these are important issues. So labor laws tell you who can be employed, of course, the question that you're raising. And most importantly, coming to your question, if I am of the age to work, I will be counted part of unemployed if I don't have a job, only if I report that I am looking for a job, I'm fit to get a job, I'm actively looking for a job, but I couldn't find a job. But if I say, I've seen some people in my neighborhood in Calcutta and other places, they are of that age where they're not properly skilled, properly literate, they didn't go to school properly. They are looking for a job. They now have given up looking for a job because they don't find one, given their educational background or training or whatever, skill level, that they have now become discouraged workers. So discouraged workers won't go and register at unemployment registration place that I'm looking for a job anymore. He's discouraged. He doesn't look for a job anymore, so he won't be counted. So when you count the labor force of a country, they have to be out of which unemployment comes. Labor force of the country is an arithmetic identity. Labor force of the country is equal to total number of people employed plus total number of people unemployed. Very simple. That is the labor force. And total number of people employed or total number of people unemployed required to meet certain criteria. Like you have to be of the working age, you have to have some skills to work or whatever, and you should be actively looking for a job. And when you find a job, you're employed. If you don't find a job, you're unemployed. Period. I am not looking for a job. Why should I be part of the total pool of unemployed people in the country? I don't look for a job. Maybe my father is so rich. I don't care. जमींदारी सिस्टम में होता था, बाप जमींदार है, अरे भूल जाओ, नौकरी कौन करेगा? All right? Okay, yes. Yeah, very good point. She's talking about seasonal unemployment. Employment. This is also a very difficult situation. In Indian national income, I teach that, but I won't teach it in the macro theory course. I can refer you to a book. Often in India, you have seasonal unemployment. Some farmer is employed for 3 months, producing a crop 4 months, doesn't have work. Now, and there is another case where somebody has a part-time job. So I'm not totally satisfied. I work for 4 hours in the evening. I don't have a morning to night job or morning to evening job, like 9 to 5 or something. I work for 2 or 3 or 4 hours, part-time job. Unfortunately, if you have a part-time job, you won't be counted as unemployed. According to the rules that apply, every country has the different rules. But probably according to international standard, you are still counted as employed. Although you have a part-time job, which is not making you happy. That is not giving you enough income. Second, seasonal unemployment is a much more difficult situation. Seasonal unemployment is basically you don't have anything to do for a very long month. So if you have your unemployment data adjusted for seasonal variations, you have to do that, then it will go up and down. In some seasons, the number is high. In some seasons, the number is low. You have to adjust that continuously across months. That's what it is. So it's a data problem that you are now talking about actual economics. All right, from theory, you're now going towards actual economics. All right. Now, this, in US, you know the frictional unemployment number is how much? It's something around 5%. Can you believe that? 5% of the labor force they allow to be counted towards frictional unemployment. So even when you have full employment, 5% or 5.5% of your labor force, of the US labor force, may not be employed because they're looking for a job. 5% is a very big number. When it comes to millions of people, it's a huge number. So frictional unemployment is a very important issue. Now, what I wanted to tell you, now if you look at the actual growth rate of output going up and down, therefore it means the actual level of output is going up and down. Now I would tell you how output is measured, that's coming later in a topic. How actual output is going up and down. So sometimes output may go very close to full employment. All right. Now you imagine if the output level crosses full employment, can it happen? Yes, it can, because 5% you're allowing for frictional unemployment. If any time frictional unemployment goes down much, because there are so many good jobs, it becomes 2% or 3%, your actual output and the unemployment number is so low and the employment number is so high that you can say your actual output has crossed full employment level of output and gone above it. It can happen because at full employment, you're keeping a margin of 5.5%. People still not employed. But if that margin shrinks, because there are so many good jobs in a booming economy, your actual employment may be much higher than the full employment level of employment, and actual output may be higher than full employment output level. Similarly, it may be at full employment level, maybe below full employment level, which can always happen. That means unemployment is rising. It's just not frictional unemployment. but what we call is in economics involuntary unemployment. You can have involuntary unemployment means I don't want to be unemployed. I'm not looking for a better job. I just don't have any job, not even a part-time. Imagine a situation. That's the seriousness of unemployment. All right? So now, therefore, the output level, growth rate would tell you a business cycle, but now you have to come down to actual output levels. All right? Through some measure, you try to find out the actual employment levels and can therefore conclude, if you have a mark for the full employment level, whether that number is above it or below it. So you can have an over full employment situation, you can have an under full employment situation. All right? Okay. Next point. Next point I want to mention. This was a confusion in Dornbusch and Fisher I had earlier, but I don't have it anymore. They talk about full employment and they also talk about potential output. Potential output. Full employment and potential output. To me, both are the same thing. What the economy is capable of producing is more or less what the full employment output is talking about. That's the maximum you can produce, giving a margin of 5.5% for frictional unemployment. Not used people who can work, who are skilled labor maybe, not used. So giving that margin, potential output and full employment output to me are the same thing, but this used to be a confusion from Dornbusch and Fisher's earlier book, earlier edition. I don't know in the new edition whether it's still that problem exists or not. So then you will hear two words, potential output, full employment output, and both are, to me, the same thing. What is the potential of a country? How much it is capable of producing? That's essentially the full employment level you're talking about. All right. Now, tell me one thing. Given the resources availability and the people, particularly the skilled labor, etc., you take the case of India, more IITs are opening, more people will get skilled labor, become skilled labor tomorrow, 5 years later, having gone through the IITs, more IITs, JEE से जो admission होगा और ज़्यादा होगा, पहले 6 IITs थे, 7 IITs थे, और बढ़ गया, all right, or 5 IITs थे, I've forgotten 7 more IITs are there. So what do you expect? The skilled labor will go up. There will be, and hopefully there will be more jobs also in the country as the economy grows. So do you think the full employment number and the potential output of a country would remain same over the years? Definitely not. So this itself is not a fixed value. This itself is a moving number which changes. So when you talk about full employment in a particular year, you have to make reference to which number you're talking about, full employment to which year. Unless it is understood that it's the full employment number for that particular year. So the full employment line itself can be a line like that, not so much of fluctuations, but with some movements, maybe continuously upward increasing line or whatever. All right? With a, what you call a convex curve maybe, going up. Now, when you have the full employment line, if you plot the actual output levels, then what you find? Suppose the full employment line is a straight line. Suppose the full employment of the potential output line. Now I am going to have here output, not any more growth rate. No, sorry. I'm going to have here time. I'm going to have here time, and I'm going to have here output now, not growth rate. So it's essentially output level I'm going to have. Okay? Output level. Suppose this is, I'm going to draw, this is the full employment line. Okay? This is the full employment line. And the actual output line, like the growth rate, may be going up and up, but sometimes if there is a deep recession, it may be going down, negative growth rate. So it will usually be a line like this, going up and going up and going up, but then it may fall a little bit, and it may be down a little bit, and it may be fall. It would also show a cyclical pattern. What I'm trying to point out, this is the actual output level. Actual output is going up. What I'm trying to tell you is that this gap which you may find is something which economists watch. What is this gap? The gap is between actual output, called YT, minus full employment output at that time period T. Okay? YT is actual output, and full employment output line, this is the YF line, and the actual output line that you have here is going up and down is the actual output line, Y. Now the gap at any time period can be, which I guess you would understand this much better than me, this actual output can be less than full employment output or can be above. So it can be greater than, equal to, less than 0. The gap can be. All right? When you have a negative number, YT, actual output is less than full employment output, typically you say the economy is under full employed or underemployed. All right. Y minus YF negative, you typically say under full employed. Or under full employment, whatever. The economy is under full employed or under full employment. And when you have Y minus YF greater than 0, you have over full employment. You have over full employment. The problem is, to me, to my mind, one can say that if it is a negative gap, the economy is not doing that well. Maybe people can say we are in kind of a recession. But recession to me means for a successive quarters, 3 months is a quarter, in a year, it's a cyclical model I'm talking about. So successive quarters, the output growth rate has been falling. Not necessarily if it is a negative gap, we have a recession, it can be a recovery. Because we were in a recession, but we are still under full employment, and we are rising and recovering actual output level. So it's becoming positive. The Y dot line, earlier Y dot line, is becoming positive. So remember, some books may have a tendency to confuse you that this actual output line of a country, for any country, if it is below the full employment line, the economy is necessarily in recession. May not be. Recession is for a successive quarters, to me, that the output growth rate is falling. May not have become negative, but falling, as in India, for instance. This is happening the past few years. All right? But suppose it has been falling, we are under full employment line, that line, but we don't have a full employment line in India. I haven't seen that number. I think we don't have a good network of information system where we collect data so well and have the numbers in front of us. So all we talk about is growth rate, growth rate. Kyunki the feeling is, if it's a high growth rate, good thing. May not be full employed, but a good thing to have. Lot more people will have a lot more income in the country, more McDonald's shop maybe. Abhi Pizza Hut bhi aa gaya dekha us din. So why worry? Acha. So I guess I'm not confusing you with this gap here, which is not growth rate, it's actual output level. And now if you have above full employment, of course nobody would say it is recession, above full employment. So you have to make the judgment when you call it a recession and when you call it a recovery. Recession is that line, you remember, going down the growth rate, recession for a successive quarters, and recoveries for a successive quarters we're going up, unless you do not call recovery. Recovery the same thing. For one quarter the growth rate improved, the next quarter it fell back. We don't call that recovery. The health is still not good. Today I'm well, tomorrow I'm not well again. Day after tomorrow again I'm well. Well, my health is not good. I haven't recovered. All right? Okay. So some textbooks might confuse you a little bit because they try to talk about too many things, which then becomes confusing. Achha. Now a very interesting, okay, I'm going to come to the last section nearly. Any question? Do you have any question? Yeah, you have a question. Why can't there be a recession above full employment? Do you think it makes any sense to call a recession over full employment? Nah. I was working overtime. Suppose I give you this example. Now I'm working full time. So I'm overtime, I was doing 4 hours, now I'm doing 2 hours of overtime. But still I'm fully employed. I have a full-time job. And I was doing earlier 4 extra hours, now I'm doing 2 extra hours. Doesn't mean I'm in a recession. Not at all. If my working hours, say, now drops from full-time hours, and the company is laying off work, there is not enough demand, which happens in capitalist countries. And I've been told that from tomorrow onwards, you will come here only for 6 hours. You're talking about recession. Not from above full employment, where I was doing kind of overtime and the economy is extra hot. Extra economy has become cold when it's not hot anymore and it is cooling off, cooling down. All right? And you have to make a judgment, is it cold enough now to call it recession? Because of the death of soldiers? Acha. Acha, theek hai, all right. Some hypothetical situation, all right. No, उतना नहीं मर जाते हैं, काफ़ी मरे हैं सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर में. बहुत दिन सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर हुआ भी नहीं. लेकिन दिन में एक दिन में पृथ्वी में जितना मरते हैं, taking all countries, including acts of terrorism, acts of crime, malnutrition, hunger, accidents, quite a few people die. I don't think that dents the line so easily. But one thing about post-war situation I want to mention, in a war-like economy, of course the resources are not diverted to use civilian products. They're all diverted to use military goods because you're at war, and particularly in a serious war, spread over quite a few months, a year. Like Second World War, for instance. It went on for about 6 years. In that kind of a situation, the economy molds itself. It doesn't produce your luxury goods all the time. The resources are used to produce military goods to protect the country. And when you're trying to produce military goods to protect the country, the extra demand for steel, extra demand for other things, certain material go up so much that you do have sometimes a booming economy. All people have jobs. They are given overnight training to work in a rifle factory, tank factory, ammunition factory, or whatever. Even housewives get involved in all kinds of jobs. In India, there won't be, even if it's a long war, there won't be any dearth of people. Don't worry. Unemployment figure won't go down a lot. India may. Like in other countries I'm talking about. So wartime often have seen, and post-war periods have seen a lot of booming economies. So your point is not countered. I mean, if people die, there are lesser funeral, so the economies are naturally very high because there is a dent in the full employment line, so the actual economy is above it automatically. So it is a booming economy. Your point is not countered. What I'm trying to say, the economy, the way it functions and overheats itself to produce the goods that are required to save the country during a war, normally doesn't happen in a peaceful peacetime in a civilian society. See, like, suppose you don't have exam. How do you perform work? You don't work like you have an exam tomorrow. You don't. You take it easy. You spend time with friends, stay up night, late night, have more chais, more cold drinks, then cannot get up the following morning. Then you say, who cares? I'm not going to go to class. Okay, but suppose you have an exam following morning. Even if you are up previous night, you will get up to go to the exam room. It's a different story, wartime. So when the economy is in a wartime mood for a long number of years, often the economy remains a booming economy in some sense. Very funny, very irony. It's an ironical situation. It's not a common sense thing, but it does happen. It's not a normal thing, but it does happen. Yes, common sense can make you understand that. Okay, now next thing I want to talk about, a few relationships which have become important in macroeconomics, etc., between the prices, output, and employment, which I have been talking about throughout. But let me tell you what the literature has done, and they have built models surrounding these issues. And models are essentially reflecting a theory. So what you have essentially, you have a theory which is a broad hypothesis, then models are built to test the hypothesis of the theory empirically. All right, so certain relationships, when theories are built, certain relationships are obtained from, the theoretical assumptions are obtained from the relationships that you observe in the real life. So prices, output, and unemployment is something I want to talk about. I wondered how much it has changed now. This is slightly old, these concepts, about 20 years old, but still very relevant, 20, 30 years old. Now, you remember the short run and the medium run macroeconomic models? In the short run, you don't have any price fluctuation because the aggregate supply line is horizontal. It fixes the price on the y-axis, fixes the point on the y-axis. Y-axis measures prices, so it cannot change anymore, horizontal line. But if you have a normal demand and a normal supply, you have a simultaneous equation model, then the two equations would determine the two unknowns, price and output. Now you are both changing. All right. Now you look up situations that there have been historical changes, revolutionary changes in thinking in macroeconomics over the years. This change first took place in the 1930s, after the 1930s depression. In 1929 to 33, I think this 4-year period was the time period for Great Depression in the Western world. So it started in US, I think, it spread to Europe, and there were major depression. Many people committed suicide, many people lost all their wealth, the stock markets crashed, because stock market is a speculative market. So you're expecting that now I buy the shares at a low price, I would sell them at a high price, and I put my money in it. But then the high price doesn't come. What will happen? You lose all your money. Now you're selling off your shares at a lower price, making capital loss as opposed to capital gain. So stock markets crashed and all that happened. That's when the first important change in economic thinking took place. Now, the thinking that took place, or the change, what it changed was, it changed what we say in macroeconomic theory. It changed from the classical macroeconomic setup that we have, framework, to a post-classical macroeconomics framework, which we call the Keynesian framework. So there, he was not a Nobel laureate. I don't think there was a Nobel Prize for economics those days. So John Maynard Keynes, this person from Cambridge University in England, essentially in his first life made money in the stock market, made a huge amount of money. And people say, many economists say, stock markets are the pulse of a country. Stock market tells you how the economy is doing. Many people say that. Now, having made money in the stock market, he probably knew all the ins and outs of a macroeconomy. Then he was a very bright man, he was very educated. So he started writing this book, which in short, we call the General Theory. So General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, which he published in 1936. So he must be writing during that depression period, sitting in England, revolutionized thinking in macroeconomics. Essentially what he did was this. In the classical macroeconomics, they had a long-run model where the supply curve was fixed, assumed. So the demand curve cannot do anything with output, only it can change prices. Let me go back to the supply curve, the long-run and the short-run models. Now, if you remember, the long run was a situation where I said, analytically speaking, in a two-dimensional diagram, I can have output level Y and price here, and the aggregate supply curve I assume to be, aggregate supply curve AS assumed to be vertical, and the aggregate demand curve is a normal aggregate demand curve. Now, what you see from this, using your simple, this diagram, is that no demand curve shift can change supply of output in the economy. Supply of output can only change if aggregate supply curve shifts, which is usually not considered to be a situation in the classical macroeconomic theory. I haven't taught you classical macroeconomic theory, I'm telling you a history right now. I will teach you classical macroeconomic theory later. It's not possible. What Keynes said, well, you have to come out of these models. The depression years, the solution to the economics problems of unemployment and falling prices, prices also fell a lot. People don't have income, they don't buy goods, so goods prices were going down. You can see from this model, if the demand curve shifts to the right, prices will go up. If the demand curve shifts to the left, prices will go down. But even if this model explains kind of fall in prices, etc., but the solution to an economic situation like that, this model doesn't suggest anything because it has fixed the supply curve vertically. So now the question is, Keynes, when he wrote the book, essentially the messages that came out in his book is that you have to change the model. I will tell you how he changed the model. It changed enormously, unbelievable. One individual contributed so much to macroeconomics, who never got a Nobel Prize, because there was no Nobel Prize in economics. Those days, well, Nobel Prize was not invented for economics. It became economics Nobel Prize much later when economists became very influential in the world probably and very glamorous figures. So now you have Amartya Sen from India also as a Nobel Prize. You have, many other people receiving Nobel Prize. Now, the point is, what I'm trying to say is that he went into essentially short-run or medium-run models where he said, now, it's not that the supply curve is vertical. The supply curve is very much upward sloping. In the very short run, it is horizontal, aggregate supply. And you have a demand curve. So now, if you have a recession, in the economy, severe recession, depression, that means people are not buying goods, output level is very low, growth rate of output is negative. You can have a medicine for the economy from outside by shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. Because if you can shift the aggregate demand to the right, if it can be shifted to the right, the aggregate demand curve, then you can see this falling price problem can be countered by now prices going up a little bit, and if prices go up, it is good for the companies because companies don't like prices falling. Companies like, in fact, not too much inflation, but they like a little bit of price rise. Because every time prices go up, the cost at which they bought the inputs, the factor services to produce the good, and there's a time lag. Now if the prices are higher compared to the prices at which they bought the resources, they always make an extra profit. So they like a price rise always. So they never like prices falling. But too much of price rise is not good. Why? Because the demand curve is downward sloping. Too much of price rise would shrink demand. People won't buy goods. That they don't like. So now the question is, counter the price rise counter the output level, these things, these movements can start taking place to cure the economy. What's the economy? In Great Depression, the economy was tied up with something called a depression, where prices were also falling along with output. So you have deflation. Price falling means deflation, opposite of inflation. So prices were falling, output also falling. Now you can see, you can have a demand curve shift and prices can stop falling, in fact can start rising, and output can increase, provided you don't make the supply curve vertical. So this is where analytically and also thinking wise differences started coming, and the new macroeconomics developed, which is known as the Keynesian macroeconomics. This is known as the demand management policy. Demand management policy is what? Government can have demand management policies where it can manipulate the demand function in a way, control it in a way, so that it can counter recession and deflation. All right? Okay? No problem? Great Depression time, in the 1930s, you had two symptoms. There was a deep recession, which is called depression, and also deflation. Now, demand management policy can counter that. You have seen in the diagram. So, Keynesian economics became very popular. Now, for about 20-30 years, it ruled the Western world, Keynesian economics. Wartime economy, again, government is putting in a lot of effort. Now, how you do that? Demand management, artificial policy? Well, if it is a government policy, how can government manage demand? Increase demand, you tell me. How can government influence the demand? If the economy is having a low demand situation, how can government increase the demand? By spending extra, created demand for goods. They can build highways, bridges, roads. Now, in a wartime economy, government does spend extra to produce the military goods. Who produces the military goods? People of the country. So it generates extra demand. They earn income. What do they do with that income? They go and buy more goods for themselves. So demand is automatically generated and can be artificially increased by government spending on infrastructure projects, etc., which we call government expenditure. So government can control that like a medicine. You're not well, your body is not creating enough immunity to protect you. You are having a fever or whatever, you're not well. I, from outside, can inject something into your system or give you a medicine which will counter that and you will start feeling better. So government expenditure is like a medicine that was suggested by Keynes. Now, this was not the thinking. Before Keynes, even the teachers who taught Keynes, well, they probably got shocked. Maybe tomorrow one of you will become a macroeconomist who shocked me because what I taught you would prove is absolutely wrong. It doesn't work. And you come up with your hypothesis. That's what happened with Keynes and his teachers at Cambridge. All right? Okay. All right. Now, demand management policies worked fine. Lekin, from the 60s and the mid-60s in particular, problems started rising after the Kennedy years. Problems started increasing in the Western world, in the US in particular. You know, people used to say when I was studying, when I was doing PhD there, they used to describe US and Europe relationship as like this. If US sneezes, Europe catches a cold. So USA में जो होता है immediately affects Europe. I think it's vice versa now with the European crisis. If Europe has a problem, it also affects USA. Anyway, so now the problem started. Keynesian policies are no longer working. And in the 80s, I remember after the 70s, there was a severe recession in the US when I was doing my PhD there. So much of a recession, I couldn't believe whether I'm in India or in the US once I went traveling there. By bus, when the bus reached Pittsburgh in the morning, and it was going through Pittsburgh, deeply hit recession areas, or other places in Chicago and Buffalo and all that, New York, you wouldn't believe me, when I looked out and saw the number of beggars on the streets and all that, and how the factories are shut, I couldn't believe. I was thinking maybe I'm back in India. In Bengal, I've seen that. When industry shut down after the the left party came into power. Slowly they shut down. I remember I was working in a government establishment and was asked to go out into the country, into the municipalities. Mile after mile by local train when I used to travel, I could see industry on both sides shut down. So I felt that I'm back home when I was in the US, in fact. Imagine the thing about impression we have about the US, the glamour and the glitter and all that. It's unbelievable, the recession. So now they found Keynesian policies are no longer working to lift the countries, the economies of the Western world out of the deep recessions. It's not working anymore. Then when again macroeconomic thinking started changing and new macroeconomics came into existence. One of the phenomena that they found, what happened there, was known as the phenomenon of stagflation. What is stagflation? This required different kind of economic policies. This required different kind of economic policies called stagflation. What is stagflation? You can see two words are influenced. Yes, stagnation, which is like a recession, and inflation. लेकिन ये मॉडल में तो inflation होगा नहीं. With stag हो सकता है इस मॉडल में. Can you explain stagflation in this model? Demand supply model? Can anybody explain demand supply model in this stagflation? Can anybody explain stagflation in this model? Use your mind. Look at it. How stagflation can occur. How can stagflation occur? When you have inflation and you have recession, what kind of a shock to the economy can start creating stagflation? Any answer? Well, it's simple. You start shifting the supply curve leftwards. You keep the supply curve shifting leftwards. What do you have? In the static framework, the diagram that I have, what do you have? Prices going up, output falling. Now, when price is going up, output falling, if you have a demand management policy, what will it do? It will try to increase output a little bit, but what will it do to prices? Huh? Beg your pardon? It will increase prices further. It will accentuate the inflation problem. If you have a stagflation here, where I'm saying that the supply curve is now shifting backwards, when supply curve shifts backwards, prices are going up, output is falling. Okay? Now you want a demand management policy. What will happen? Depending upon the slope of the supply curve, how steep it is, how flat it is. Suppose it is very steep. If the demand curve shifts, it will not have much influence on output, but it will have a tremendous influence on prices. Therefore, if the supply curve is very steep and there is a demand curve, now when the supply is shifting, all right, from here to here it goes, output falls, prices increase. Now, government says, okay, we are going to use Keynesian policy. This is aggregate demand. This is aggregate demand. Okay? Now say we are going to use demand management policy to counter that. Will it be able to counter that? Stagflation. Demand management policy will shift the demand curve outwards. Output increase would be some, depending upon what the slope of the supply curve is, but prices would increase further. If you have price and you have output here, prices would increase further. Do you see that? Do you see that? So it's not solving the problem. Inflation is a big ill. Who likes inflation? Nobody likes inflation. You have some money. Tomorrow when you go and buy goods in the market, you see that money is worth less. You can buy fewer goods because the prices have gone up. So nobody likes inflation. All right? So stagflation, when it started occurring, particularly in the 70s and 80s, then the Keynesian policies were completely declared bankrupt. because they're not curing the problems. It was fine for a while. But then you have the new macroeconomics coming up, and they came, and new models came. I did not go into that because the basics I am going to teach in this course. I'm not going to go into the details. So fundamental changes, therefore, if there is a stagflationary situation, what is the answer? How would you resolve? Is demand management policy going to work? No. It cannot be very effective anymore. If there is stagflation, then what kind of a policy you require? Any answer? What kind of a policy do you require? Supply. Supply side policies are required. The supply curve has to shift out. Prices will come down. Employment would increase, output would increase. You need supply management policies, not demand management policies. So the question is, which kind of macroeconomic models you require to have supply management policies, which is more difficult for government, I found. Government is very smart in using demand management policies. Government is completely the opposite when it comes to having supply management policies. Because the supply side in a capitalist society is in the hands of whom? Private sector, and they do not directly influence them, they can influence them indirectly. They don't control them. So it becomes more difficult for government to have an effective supply management policy. Government demand management policy is very easy. Arey, spend karo jada. Central banks say they borrowed more money, spend it more on infrastructure projects. More people will get employment. Narega in India, the big thing, government thing, Narega, what is it? Demand management policy, trying to provide some income, minimum food requirements for some very poor people. It's government expenditure, demand management policy. It increases employment, it increases income, but temporarily only, not on a permanent basis. All right? So therefore, what you see here, when stagflation came, Keynesian policies are not working because Keynesian policies were demand management policies. All right. So the macroeconomics changed quite a bit after that. They went on more on supply-based models than demand-based models.